Good afternoon, everyone. We haven't everyone in the audience here as yet. They're still returning after lunch. However, I think we will get started as we're starting off again with a recap of the things that we heard in the morning, which is obviously it's especially aimed at our online audience and especially those who are only joining us in the afternoon. So we'll start that in just a second when we're. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Right, and we start off this morning with a keynote from Lord Willits, who's a man who wears a lot of hats. The hats that he was speaking this morning were largely those actually linked with his roles in the space agency and in UCRI, and he was explaining that actually the UK government has a strong wish that we should lead us internationally in the area of space sustainability, equally in the policy areas and in implementing strategies for space sustainability. And he discussed this is a problem that has a lot of facets. There are a lot of technical issues, although equally legal issues and social and economic issues, and that then actually led in an interesting discussion over funding, in that even though UCRI was established to help aid interdisciplinary research, that still isn't easy, and there was an issue of how we can have someone in UCRI think actually own SSA as an area, and hopefully he will have a look into that now, which would be great if he did. And there was another issue about how researchers are able to have access into SSA data that's generated in space agency and or UCRI funded research, and that was another issue that he would have a look into for us, and which means all in all, I think it was a very constructive opportunity to have him here. So that's good. After that, and we had this discussion of international aspects, and we heard initially from Paddy Neumann in Australia, who leads a startup actually looking into pulsar propulsion, which is extremely nifty in that it actually uses debris as a propellant for the tugs that remove other debris, which is actually a really nifty idea, I think. And he emphasized this is an area that actually needs international collaboration, and there isn't any organization or indeed any one country that has all the expertise, and hence it was interesting then after that to hear about SSA activities in Japan, and in particular to hear that there have been collaborative arrangements established between JAXA and the Space Agency and DSTL, and those always looked extremely interesting and hopefully fruitful. And after that, we had an interesting view of SSA activities in China, which is often hard to hear about otherwise. So that was good. We heard about actually SSA assets that are operating in China and about their space white paper, which includes statements about an intention to engage actively in international discussions, although in our audience's discussions afterwards, there was a degree of skepticism about how active China is at the moment, and there was a discussion of how we can change that and improve that. And after that, there was a panel discussing the role of defense in space sustainability, and everyone agreed that the issues of security and sustainability of space are intimately linked. Although equally everyone agreed that the priority for defense organizations is the security end of that. However, it was argued that if you have security and sustainability ought to follow, or at the very least, if you want sustainability, that you have to have security to start with. And then we had an extremely interesting discussions about how we can help early career researchers who are interested in space sustainability, how they can hear about actually what the opportunities are in this area in industry and academia, and a discussion of the skills which are needed, and the strategy for attracting students into this area as against into the tech sector, which is after students with the same skills and is offering them a larger amount of cash than is on offer in space usually. And there was a discussion about the barriers to entry, that space sustainability is an interdisciplinary area, which means it's not what anyone has studied as their degree, which means that they need extra experience or extra training afterwards. And we discussed that there are on offer a number of internships and opportunities for volunteering, which can help to build experience and contacts. Since, as with everything else, it's as much who you know as what you know. And we discussed that if we want to have a lot of students who are interested in this area, we need to inspire them at an early age about space as a career, and that's from school ages upwards, really. And then the final barrier that we discussed was actually the structure of adverts, that they ought not always to expect a candidate who has all the experience that's needed in the job, that they ought to be after those who have the potential and the interest, expecting there will be skills you have to learn on the job. And I think that's about it. And everything, recordings of all of these will be on the website soon. And with that, I shall hand over to Katherine, who's sharing the next bit.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And we have some very interesting speakers coming up to give us their reflections about how other legal frameworks from other domains can be used to help understanding how we could build legal frameworks for sustainability in space. And our first speaker is joining us online. It's Dr. Poorvi Kantroo, and she is a director of space law and policy at the Aerospace and Aviation Lawyers Association of India. She's also the chairperson of the Global Compact for the Space Task Force at the International Academy of Space Law, and I'm sure many other strings to your bow as well. So, Dr. Kantroo, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katherine, for such an introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's 5:30 in Seattle right now, and here we are talking about global problems. Let me share my screen. So today we are going to talk about the entire conference is about sustainability, and there are various multiple facets that might have been covered before me and after me as well will be covered. But one thing in particular that enticed me today to speak about here is, if we identify red flags to this sustainability, there are chances we will be able to find better solutions to these global problems. And one of the key red flag that has been identified all across the globe is debris. The reason why this debris is not just because of simple proliferation of space and space activities, but also because of the kinetic technologies like ASAT, cybersecurity threats, space-to-space warfare, or even a proliferation of space by the private sector. Until now, we have only categorized that the threats can be between two nations or between two countries, but as and how businesses advance, commercialization takes up, there can be two private entities as well, hypothetically speaking, that could also engage into a space warfare where the global, the space becomes the final frontier. So all these red flags point to one question alone. Is the international law silent? Is the international space law per se, because it's an advanced branch of space law, is it silent? Or what has it done till now to combat these issues? Or to put in simple words, how do states get away with it? For example, the ASAT, which has been tested by US, China, India, Russia recently. Now, coming up with a statement recently that 7 actors have come out saying that we would ban ASAT, but once you have tested it, once you know that you are capable and you have developed the capability, and then going back and saying we ban it, doesn't make much sense. So let us dissect and analyze as to identify the problem here under the Outer Space Treaty, which is the Magna Carta of space law here. So we have clearly seen that the founding fathers of outer space have said that there needs to be due care, and Article 9 envisages it very clearly, but it kind of fails to capture this problem here. So the question here is, how are we able to forbid ASAT under the umbrella of Outer Space Treaty? So a clear dissection would come up to a point that there are gaps and challenges within the outer space here. First is, when we talk about Article 9 of the outer space, it says that the mandate to avoid harmful contamination, and then it says there needs to be an obligation to avoid adverse changes, or there has to be a directive for prior international consultation. This is exactly verbatim what Article 9 says. But the first question is, nowhere in the Outer Space Treaty has the word debris been defined. Nowhere in the Outer Space Treaty have we spoken about what amounts to, or what exactly is the definition for harmful contamination. Is it the environment? Is it the, or any kind, what exactly caters to harmful contamination? Second, what do you imply by adverse changes? Is it a radioactive change? Is it a frequency change? What kind of a change? Is it a change in the terrain? What kind of change are they referring to? Third, directive for prior consultation. Now, any nation who would test an ASAT, for example, or any cyber, or go for a cyber threat or cyber activity as such, why would there be any prior international consultation taken? Because one of the clause for the international consultation says you need to have a reason to believe, and none of the nations will get up and say that there was a reason to believe that an international consultation had to be taken place. So if we are going with experimental activities which are space to space, which are from ground laser to space, such as the ASAT, where you kill your own satellite, which are from ground to ground, all of these are missing under the gambit of Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. So somewhere or the other, there is an ambiguity in the outer space. We talk about due care, but then due care has to be elaborated, or it has to be, you know, in a broader spectrum taken by the countries. So if we look at a way forward here, we are talking about security, we are talking about safety, and we are talking about sustainability. Safety and security are being two major chunks which will cater to sustainability of the outer space. Whether the attack is offensive or whether the attack is defensive, whether it is for a safety purpose or whether it is for a security purpose, it is condemnable. So not taking much time here, I would re-emphasize saying that the way forward for a space which is sustainable for future generations, a space which is at present congested, contested, needs a comprehensive framework which will not just cater to a simple ASAT ban, but a treaty or a framework which is inclusive in nature. When I say inclusive approach, I mean an approach where everyone's consent is taken, not just the haves, the north-south divide, where everyone's interest is taken into picture, where nations are, there is a confidence building measure between the nations, where nations are able to engage in an activity where they can share the knowledge that they have to avoid any kind of accident, to avoid any kind of collision, to avoid any kind of warfare tactics or strategies that are being manipulated in outer space. Now, the question here is, if we provide an analogy from various other branches of law, it comes very handy. Anyone would, for that matter of fact, say high seas are one example. UNCLOS can be relied on, or Arctic Treaty can be relied on. But then somewhere or the other, they fail to solve the purpose, because eventually the terrain in the outer space has one thing that none of these treaties are able to provide a solution for, and that is visibility. the visibility in the outer space becomes so different from all these terrains that we are not able to copy paste, or we are not able to even borrow parallels from these kind of treaties which are already existing. So here, creation of such kind of a nodal agency which would come under the belt of UN Corpus, or which would monitor, which would engage, which would keep a check on the activities which are happening in outer space that are a threat to the catastrophic debris that is being created. The second pointer that I want to bring here is filling the definitional gaps near what amounts to due care, what amounts to harmful contamination, what amounts to debris, or this kind of an impact that it has on the sustainability or the outer look of the space. Most importantly, if you look at the private sector here, because space belongs to all, even the public and the private equally, catering to concepts such as corporate social responsibility, where every single player acts responsibly before they send their satellites in outer space. So that kind of an atmosphere where you are kind of very careful about the needs and wants of other nations, respectfully, so as to say. And like I said, creating an inclusive approach where everyone is heard, where everyone's needs are met. For example, from the environmental law, we have borrowed a concept of common but differentiated responsibility. Those who are done with their spacefaring abilities also need to give that slot or give that spectrum to the nations who are still trying to create a capacity for sending satellites, whether it is for navigation, whether it is for radioactivity, whether it is for radio sensing, so on and so forth. And creating norms which are based on communication, which have constraints on harmful activities like weapons of mass destruction or ASAT or cyber threats, creating an atmosphere of due care that will increase the sustainability, and creating such technological feasibility where a satellite, once its life cycle ends, either goes to the graveyard or comes back itself, that helps keep the orbit clean, and creating such kind of confidence between the nations where they're able to share that sensitive information, thereby increasing the space situational awareness for all other nations who are trying to be a new player and who have not even sent satellites. And I speak not just on behalf of the North-South divide, or I speak on behalf of those nations who have never ever tried their hands sending even one remote satellite to the outer space. So that's all from me today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kantroo. If you're able to stay for some questions towards the end, that would be great. Sure. I think rather than taking questions now, I will hand the floor over to Rajeshwari Suryakanth Nagamarpalli. It's a mouthful. Hope I pronounced it correctly. And she is from the University of Edinburgh Law School, but she's also the head of research for interstellar space technologies. And so over to you.
Thank you, Katherine. Environment. We're talking about military deficiencies. We're talking about cyber law, robotics. We're talking about glaciers melting, environment being harmed. What about the space environment? SpaceX wants to launch 100 satellites. Oh, we're providing internet to other companies. But what is actually happening to the space environment? Who's really taking care of it? Climate change on Earth can be reversed. But what about space? We cannot really reverse space damage, right? Deterrence has not become a default policy for any state in outer space. Has it? I doubt so. We're talking about polluter pays principle, prevention, precautionary principle. We're talking about life cycle assessment, circular economy model for space. But who is really implementing it? What is really happening? How far is it going? What about the technological advancements? We're talking about ballistics, lasers, anti-missile technologies. It's mad. It's crazy. Every day we come up with something new. With China taking monkeys to space. Wow. Isn't it funny? Like, think about the technological advancements and what are the repercussions in the environment in space? How the ozone layer is being depleted. Just the launch impacts to 70% of climate change on Earth and even up in space. It's creating a hole in the ozone layer, which we are living in tomorrow. So when it comes to the depletion of natural resources, the manufacturing of solar panels of satellites is solely responsible because of the use of germanium, right? So these are causes for both backward and forward pollution. Nobody's talking about. Everyone, we have assessments for environmental effects of satellites up and down on Earth, but what about space? We're not really having environmental footprints for space launches or satellites or laser technologies, which we're providing up in space. There's several commonalities here. I'm here to talk about how international environmental law can help fill the gap between international space law. So 1967 was the space treaty. After that, 65 years, we've just been launching and advancements. But today I'm here to say that international environmental law enforcement can actually help fill the regulatory gap in space, right? How do we say that? First, the vastness of space makes it difficult to monitor and patrol space. Second, the lack of effective implementation and consensus of the international legal framework of space activity makes it difficult to prosecute violators. There was a space junk crashing the far side of the moon. Nobody wants to take liability. Who should be actually hold liable? We don't know. China says it's not me. Russia says not me. SpaceX not me. Then who? Me? No. So we don't really know who's really responsible. So we need to have a proper enforcement mechanism, a regulatory system up in check. We need to see how the manufacturers, the extended producer responsibility should be held responsible, how the manufacturers down and up in space. You need to undergo, like the CAA for the UK should have a stricter, stringent licensing regime of how environmental impact assessment can be held and what's going to happen. Can you really bring back the satellite if it's launched? We're sending up satellites to remove active debris removals and everything. But how successful is it? Half of them cannot even be tracked. 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters, you cannot really track it. So what about the deficiencies there? How can environmental law help fill the gap? We can actually look deeper. No country wants to enforce it because every country, after the Moon Treaty, no country has actually signed up a space treaty, right? And then we're just fighting that today we want a legal framework. Tomorrow Russia is like, I have my own domestic law. US has its own domestic law, but we need to have, like, I'm going to take Paddy Newman's last line where he said, we need to have an international collaboration where we don't have one solution. We need to come together to form a solution, right? So I'd like to end by saying there is no way the space industry can be green example of sustainability in the modern world because of technological limitations and sluggish approach to its growth. That's why I say deterrence is what we need. Environment, let's fight for it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'm sure that will stimulate some good questions, but I just wanted to move first to our third speaker, who is Professor Ram Jakhu, who is joining us from Canada. And I'm hoping that we have you, Ram. Hello. And could I know that you're going to be sharing your expertise with us about the things we can learn from military law. It would be helpful if you could give just a quick introduction to you and your area of interest. Thank you. Still on mute.
Does it work?
Now we can hear you. Oh, you've gone back on mute.
Sorry about it.
It's fine. Now
All
we
right,
can
thank you very much. Yeah, at McGill University, I have been specializing in space law. I have some experience in International Space University in Strasbourg. So my field is essentially space law. Part of that is military law or military uses of outer space. I'm heading a study. It's about 6-7 years old study now. It's kind of finished next year. It's the drafting of McGill manual on international law applicable to military uses of outdoor space. It's big name. Simply means what the law is that regulates military space activities. All right. Again, thank you very much for inviting me. The topic is really complex, and I hope I can do justice in 5 minutes. Let me put up front what is my thesis, what is my concern, what is that? As we speak, militarization and weaponization of outer space continue rapidly, and it endangers everybody, and close those who are the main actors behind it. It's just and follow up what Poorvi and Rajeshwari mentioned earlier. We are in a big trouble, and that trouble is created by us, nobody else. So I don't, us mean humanity, and I will put it very frankly, the 5 big nations, mainly the permanent members of the Security Council. And I have my lot of other ideas, but again, say they are the responsibility. If I had to point out to someone or someone, I'll put out to, rather than giving a responsibility or pointing my finger, my finger will be going to these 5 nations. Those who have, I dare to say, those who have violated the trust which international community gave it in when the United Nations Charter was adopted. So let's go through a few points, and I'll come back to the issue we'll discuss. Now, I've been asked to look at the intersection between military law and space law. So in my view, military law simply means the law which governs military operations, and that includes the conduct of a war. Under international law, war is always judged twice. One is the reasons for going to war, and second is means and methods of war. So what it is divided, it divides into 2 parts. One is the prohibition of use of force, which is also known as the just bellum, what kind of laws are there which prohibits the use of force. The other is when the war activity starts, and then what kind of means and methods can be used. Here, I generally say everything is fair in love and war. I don't think that is true, neither in love nor in war. So the rules which must be followed and manners and etiquettes must be followed. So the whole concept is wrong, and I think people should realize everybody is not free to go to war. Everybody is not free under the law to do whatever it wants, even during wartime. So that is that point I will allude, I'll discuss later on in case we have time. So I want to essentially concentrate on the prohibition of use of force. Space law and military law, they complement each other. And that is very clear from Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is the states shall carry on the activities in exploration and use of outer space in accordance with the international and the UN Charter. So international law and UN Charter are applicable to all military activities. And when say international law, that means all branches of law, including international humanitarian law. And international space law makes no distinction between military activities and civilian activities. This is what generally not well understood, except Article 4. For example, registration is required for space objects, both those who are used for military purposes, for civilian purposes. Damage is covered whether it's caused by civilian satellites or military satellites. Responsibilities for both rescue and return. So all space law is applicable to both the civilian and the military side of that, except one I mentioned to Article 4, which I'll allude to that point. Even Lyndon Johnson, the former president of the United States, said when the Outer Space Treaty was adopted, he said the treaty was the most important arms control development since the limited test ban treaty. So that means it covers both sides. So just two main issues. One, not issue, the instruments are very important to keep in mind. The first is, of course, the Charter. Charter makes absolutely clear that the threat or use of force against other nation is prohibited. No ifs, no buts, and that's what it is. And that has been recognized by the International Court of Justice in 1986, that non-use of force is a principle of customary international law. And that we have seen, normally this is not implemented, but we have seen recently when the General Assembly adopted a resolution with 141 states voting for that, which deplored in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against the Ukraine in violation of Article 2, Para 4 of the UN Charter. Now, the other treaty is Partial Test Ban Treaty, adopted before the Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits the conduct of nuclear weapon tests in atmosphere and outer space. And then we have a 1976 NMOD Convention, which prohibits the use of environmental techniques to manipulate natural forces of outer space. Now, these two treaties, the 1963 Treaty, Partial Test Ban Treaty, and Mann, have been very successful. So there's a hope that international law can achieve something but beside that, there has not been very good examples. So let's look at the main treaty, Outer Space Treaty, which first thing is we have seen we should keep in mind Outer Space Treaty was adopted to contribute to international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. The goal was peaceful uses. Later we'll see the word peaceful has been interpreted differently. And also outer space should be explored and used in the interest of maintaining international peace and security, for promoting international cooperation and understanding. This is a binding obligation of the states. Whenever they undertake any activity, including military activity, they must be aware of their responsibility, that their activities must be for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Any action which goes contrary to this goal or this response, this duty, in my view, they are in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. So Article 4 is the main provision of the treaty. Now, it prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit around Earth and stationing them on celestial bodies. But that article is not perfect. It has been designed to keep weaknesses in that or gaps in that. Those are not creation by anybody else except the countries those two major countries, Soviet Union at that time and United States, designed that way. This article, what it does not prohibit military uses of outer space per se. So military uses of outer space are permitted under this article. This article does not ban anti-satellite weapons. It does not ban space-based ballistic missile defense systems, and it does not ban frictional orbital bombardment system. So those are the gaps or weaknesses or intentional exceptions which have been created by the countries who negotiate this treaty. More importantly, after the adoption of the treaty, the meaning of the word peaceful has been changed. Earlier, peaceful means non-military. But then there was a controversy between Soviet Union and United States. Soviet Union was of the opinion that peaceful means non-military, and that is what generally understood by other countries. By US was the view that peaceful includes military activities, but it prohibits aggressive activities. And that, sadly, I will say, has been the norm since then. That is the meaning which has been accepted by nation, and that has been created a really major problems, as we'll see later on. And then the end result of that is that militarization and weaponization continue irrespective of that. Those are the gaps. And also, I will say, intentional efforts for countries not to negotiate any other treaty. And Poorvi mentioned earlier, Rajeshwari mentioned earlier that after 79 days, there has been no treaty. So let me get into my perception of the whole thing. I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. Humanity is facing very serious challenge today, and I will say as we speak. What is happening is that there are national efforts being made by major powers, including, I will say, US, Russia, China, UK, Canada, other countries, with respect to exclusive control of or dominant space. More countries are using space for military purposes. More aggressive uses are being made for militarization. More uses of civilian satellites for military purposes. More space assets are being used for actual war fighting. There's a trend towards from militarization to weaponization. More satellites, more devices are being developed and tested kind of anti-satellite system. New threats to space assets are increasing. New and dedicated space forces, both for offensive and defensive purposes, are being set up. Space doctrines are being propagated, like space war is inevitable. Space is war fighting domain. These are the doctrines which are being circulated or propagated. And space war rules of war are being drafted or adopted, and space war games are being conducted. So what we have seen is that, in October, Russia threatened, mentioned that the satellite belonging to SpaceX could be legitimate target during war with Ukrainian war, and the US said, look, don't touch them. So there's all a tension which is going on in actual war. So all that, the law what we have seen is not very effective. Actually, is being ignored, misinterpreted, and so a number of efforts have been made to come up with this, to fill up the gaps. And I don't want to go to all details. I say started with missile control technology regime, code of conduct against ballistic missile defense, and China, Russia, PPW treaty, draft treaty, European code of conduct, prevention of arms race and outer space resolutions, unilateral declarations on controlling weapons in space, and all those kind of things have been there, but none of them have been successful. Nothing has been achieved. So finally, in my view, conflict in space or war in space is not inevitable. And I'm glad to know that the United States recently and Red Cross holds the same opinion. I believe space is not a war fighting domain. I'm sorry to say NATO is wrong. Space is not an operational domain. It is being made. It is being perceived that way. So those things can be avoided and must be avoided. If war occurs in space, the consequences are going to be devastating for everybody. So, but in my view, the state of the world is very grave currently. Doomsday clock is only 100 seconds to midnight. The Secretary General of the United Nations expressed that international community has been warned before. He has warned that our world is in peril and paralyzed, and international law is undermined by geopolitical divisions. And that is the central point. So there are clear divisions. Solutions are available, can be sought. They are not being taken simply because geopolitical divisions. So I think it is for everybody to be concerned about it. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be glad to expand on those points.
Thank you very much. That's been a very interesting series of 3 talks. And if everyone isn't terrified by the end of that one, then you're you've fallen asleep after lunch. I just wanted to make sure that the people who are attending online know that they can put their questions into the Q&A function. I don't see any questions online right now. I wanted to ask if anybody in the room had any questions for any of our speakers, or any reflections that you might like to make. Yeah.
Thanks, Katherine. Luke Cornwell. I would just like to say there was a lot of talk of what we need to do and what we need to be looking towards, going towards what we need definitions of. Ram, towards the end there, you started listing off some of the different policies that were in place but hadn't actually made much change. Can the panel give me any, or give us, sorry, any examples of things that you know of that are in development, which they're policies and things that are going to be put in place in the future, which might help to actually make a change? So yeah, any concrete examples of stuff coming up, not just the past stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to take that question
I can
first,
take it.
Rajesh? Yes, let's do that.
Yeah, so one of it is British Standard Institute. So it's the first one, which is incorporating BS 0018. That's the circular economy standard by the ISO. So it's having circular economy standards for satellites. So that's one of the policy UK is implementing in its ignition phase. So 2022 to 2023, UK is in its ignition phase of National Space Policy Strategy. So this is one of the implementation policies it's actually incorporating. And it's taking example of Waste Amendment Act by Wales and England. That's the enactment. Yes. Hope that helps.
Bram, could I ask if you have any examples?
Okay. Recently, a resolution has been adopted by General Assembly. That resolution was initiated by Russia and other countries, and that says that no first placement of weapons in outer space, means no weapons in outer space. That was adopted by 130 states in favor, 35 against, mainly Western nations. And the second resolution, which has been adopted very recently by the First Committee of the General Assembly, which is initiated by United States, which asks for moratorium on the destructive anti-satellite weapons in space. And that has been adopted by 154 states in favor, and 3 abstention, but China and Russia oppose that. To me, these 2 resolutions make sense, and they must be combined, and all countries should adopt that. There's a very simple thing. It doesn't really matter whether they had weapons or any weapons. They should be adopted. That again, I come to the point that I made it. The onus is on these 5 big nations. If they get together, this, I think, will be fantastic to be adopted. That's what I personally would like to see happening.
Okay, geopolitical tensions at the moment might make it difficult to accomplish that, but I wholeheartedly agree. Dr. Kantroo, do you have anything that you'd like to add about things that are actually happening now? Oh, you're still on mute.
Yes, exactly like Ramsa said, these resolutions are an eye-opener, and they are showing that the momentous is on. Giving a little a little picture from India as well. India is also trying to gear up for its first Space Act, and it is trying to make, even though it has conducted ASAT and it has also been one of the 5, but they are also trying to go for a treaty, a national comprehensive, a framework where they could incorporate all of these pointers and make it binding. And once you have your domestic implementation, that strongly says that the country is geared up to, represent itself, that we are a peace-loving nation, and we would want to go by the laws of international law here. So that's one example here. If nations incorporate these international treaties into their domestic laws, that's one way of showing that we are trying to be better than what we were, or we are trying to come out in a stronger way and help keep sustainability in its consideration.
That's a very good point. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I know that to date there have been something like 170. I'm sure actually the three of you would know the number better than I. It's 170 signatories to the Outer Space Act, but only a few dozen nations have actually implemented that into their national legislation. And so there's quite a long way to go to encourage those other countries to implement national legislative frameworks that incorporate those principles. If there are any other questions in the room.
Katherine, can I
Yes,
just,
yes, please do come
just
back.
1 second. You raised a very good point that it might not be possible to have some kind of solution to the problem because what is going on today, right? I believe that actually crises are the right time to come up with a solution which makes sense. And if you see that 1963 treaty was adopted during or after Cuban crisis.
Yes.
So I think, in my view, if the people from these countries, major countries, are really listening to me, this is the time for sanity. Humanity cannot keep on fighting. This is the time to come, hey, there's some hope there. Thank you.
That's a very good point, and a much more optimistic way of
Right.
looking at the current situation.
Exactly.
Thank you. I can now go home and sleep much more easily
Right.
tonight.
Second point, here that I would want
Yes.
to highlight, like I said in my presentation as well, it is not just the nations fighting. These are two corporations that are going to fight. If nations started, the corporations will only pick pace. So unless nations prioritize making these laws mandate and give it enforceability and fangs of enforceability, only then can you put to rest the other actors and make space a fair game for everyone.
I think the example from environmental law and the implementation of environmental law and then the enforcement of environmental law is a very good area to study, because that has been a long time coming, but it now does have teeth, doesn't it? And I guess one of the interesting things I thought was raised both by Poorvi and yourself was that we have no enforcement entity. There isn't that agency whose intergovernmental agency whose responsibility it is to monitor and enforce compliance with even existing guidelines and norms. So I'd be very interested to hear what all three of you think about that. Where do we find that agency? How can we have that development?
I think the IPCC can be one way, because it already has enforcement mechanisms for climate change. So that can be one of the ways. Or we can even look at the radio spectrum, and that can be one of the guiding ways as well. The ITU. ITU would be a very good, if it starts looking to the internet satellites and how the dual use technologies can be monitored. Because if there's no space, then you can't really have a war in space. So there's no environment. So you're done. So that's what I think.
Can I ask you, Ram, do you have a view?
I think we don't need to create any organization. There's already one there, which is Security Council. If these 5 members start working, looking at their responsibility, they can do everything. The power in the charter, they have enormous power. If the humanity is asked to come up with another charter, I don't think humanity will come with the same charter. All the countries have given the authority to 5 nations to rule the world. And that's what I see. What is decided by Security Council? Every other nation is obliged to respect that. That is the power which is given to Security Council. The problem is, it doesn't matter what organization is set up. Until there's a cooperation among these 5 nations, you won't be in a position to achieve anything. And they don't have to do anything except just do their homework or the task or respect the obligation in good faith. By the way, there's a morality issue also. They are supposed to be respecting or fulfilling their obligation in good faith, the morality.
And Poorvi, did you have something to add?
I think this was a very, very academically enriching, eye-opening answer for me as well this morning. I, with my humble submission, would have felt that an organization as ICAO, it may not be exactly like ICAO, but somewhere on the lines that could monitor and govern every kind of threat, that could keep a transparency, that could help the space situational awareness not to be just on pen and paper between the nations, but create that kind of an atmosphere which urges nations, and not just nations, but also these private actors, to transfer data before any collision takes place, before any intentional or unintentional destruction of these satellites takes place, whether it is by missile, whether it is by kinetic force, whether it is from cybersecurity, from ground, from space to space, whatever terrain it is, how you conduct the the attack. But there is a need for an agency where monitoring is needed and governance is needed. So we are talking about space law, but space law is incomplete without space policy, because we all know it is a geopolitical terrain that we are dealing with. So space law and policy need space governance. And when you say governance, there needs to be an organization that controls it. There needs to be a nodal agency that governs it, because we are talking about a terrain where visibility is the problem. Most of these spacefaring nations have abilities which they have not shared information about. As time comes, they will reveal. Therefore, there needs to be an organization that controls and monitors and governs and regulates space for its peaceful conduct.
Thank you. I personally agree with you. I think there is a lot of work that needs to happen before the nations come together around that. There has been a question from online attendees asking about the ideal enforcement arm for signatories who violate the Outer Space Treaty. I would love to get into that and also talk about liability convention and why it's never been tested. There are a lot of things that we could talk about, but we are running out of time completely. So I don't want to hold up the next session. What I would ask is, could I just ask for one last word from each of you? If there's one thing that you think you'd like people to take away from this session, what is your key message?
I think we really need to be responsible for our actions, and we need to be aware of what we're launching and how we're launching, and everything starts from ground. That's what I like to say.
Thank you. And Ram?
I agree with Poorvi. I think there's a need for organization for sure. There's no doubt about it. But by the way, Katherine, the liability convention has been tested in a case between Canada and Soviet Union and Cosmos 954.
Okay. I'll have to go look that case up. And Poorvi, last word to you, since you're up so early after such a late night.
Thank you. Space for all is what I say. Let's keep it that way. Space for all, from the haves to the have-nots, from the poorest of the country like Ecuador, who sent its one satellite that was broken in and got defunct and had to pay nations money again to fix that satellite. Think about that small nation as well. Space for all is my message today. Thank you.
Space for all. That's a great message for all of us. Can I ask us to thank our speakers? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.